Gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Chris DeMuth. I'm a fellow here at the Hudson Institute, and I'm happy to welcome you here for this session on the Chinese threat to America's industrial and high-tech future, the case for a U.S. industrial policy, which will be centered on a presentation by my Hudson colleague Arthur Herman, who is a senior fellow here and director of Hudson's Quantum Alliance Initiative. Arthur is a historian and classicist who has forged a two-track scholarly career here at Hudson. First, he is the author of big, best-selling, highly prized books on political, military, and cultural history, beginning with How the Scots Invented the Modern World in 2002. Most recently, his biography of Douglas MacArthur, American Warrior, in 2016, and in 2017, his book, 1917, Lenin, Wilson, and the Birth of the New World Disorder. His second track is research on a range of current issues in high technology and U.S. security and military strategy, ranging from the energy fracking revolution to missile defense, 5G communications deployment, the new frontier of quantum computing, the U.S.-Japan military alliance, and more, where Arthur has produced a steady stream of Hudson reports and articles in all of the major national media. These two tracks of his career converge in his essay, America Needs an Industrial Policy, in the new winter 2019 issue of American Affairs, which we have distributed and which is the subject of today's session. In it, he strides confidently into the raucous new nationalism debates over the proper role of government in the private market economy, with an argument and set of proposals drawn from his important 2012 book, Freedom's Forge: How American Business Produced Victory in World War II. Arthur is going to make a presentation. After that, we are going to have a discussion session where Julius Krein and I will ask him some tough questions and maybe some friendly ones, and he will no doubt bowl us over. Julius is the editor of American Affairs, which he founded in early 2017. He is one of the impressive new intellectual lights to have emerged in the new American political epoch that began in 2016. His journal, American Affairs, is a leading venue of inquiry and debate that aims to transcend the traditional liberal-conservative divides. After Arthur's presentation, we will have a discussion among the three of us up here and then turn to audience question and answer. Please give a warm welcome to Arthur Herman.
Thank you, Chris. Do you have the slide thingy? Go get it. Yeah, that's what I need. How are you? Thanks for coming. Delighted you could be here. I think this is going to be fun, actually. It'll be, I hope, instructive, but I think it'll also be enjoyable as we talk about what has become increasingly, as you'll see, increasingly a matter of discussion and debate, which is does America need a new model, a new paradigm for the way in which the federal government in particular is involved in economic affairs and shaping the direction, the present and future direction of the U.S. economy. Just 2 days ago, Senator Marco Rubio did a speech over at the National Defense University on the need for an industrial policy. I'm pretty sure he wrote that after reading my article. But in any case, you have with you the article that we ran in American Affairs Journal, the latest issue. So I'm not going to try and summarize the article as such, and I'm not going to, in some points I'll refer you to the details which are in the article, but I want to talk about why the article took shape the way in which it did, and what the larger context is in which this issue of industrial policy, of a new industrial policy of America, starts to make sense. And I say this because the disclaimer I have to begin with is I have been trained not to be a fan of industrial policy. Industrial policy, in my experience working on economic history and on American European history, tends to center on things like this. This is the terrain in which industrial policies have been directed. It's how to revive a manufacturing base. It's about how to bring jobs back or keep jobs in the United States. It's about America's economic competition with other countries which seem to be surging ahead in critical areas of the economy. Back in the 1980s, the 70s and 80s, it was Japan. Today, it is, of course, China. But the thing that always struck me about those plans, those industrial policy plans, whether they were developed here in the US by thinkers and policymakers or developed elsewhere in Europe, in Latin America, and elsewhere, what struck me about them is that most of them ended up being blatant failures. That far from solving the problems that they had set out to solve, that they end up creating more problems than they had anticipated. What is an industrial policy? Well, it's generally defined as a set of extraordinary measures implemented by the government in order to overcome or compensate for market failure in the economy. And that term also bothered me, because what is a market failure? How do you define that? In fact, in many ways, we can say that the current situation in which we face in terms of industrial policy isn't really a market failure. Markets are doing what they've set out to do. In many cases, this has happened. The problem has been that there are just certain things that markets are not very good at doing, and at certain points and junctures in history and in the times, it becomes important to focus on those things that the markets don't do particularly well, and to figure out ways in which to solve that kind of issue. So market failure, I don't like that term. It's one that gets bandied around. Let's just say it's things that slip through the cracks of the usual workings of a free market, open competition type of economy. But come back to my question, the issue that I started with, and that was, again, of being trained by generations of free market advocates to think of industrial policy as a bust. And a bust not only in an intellectual sense, but also in reality, in the empirical reality of the efforts to implement them and the failure to break down. And what I concluded in writing this article and surveying the literature with regard to efforts at industrial policy around the world, that the real problem with industrial policy, why they were always failures, is that industrial policies were developed by economists. Now, don't misunderstand me. I love economists. Some of my best friends are economists. If a son or daughter came to me and said, I want to marry an economist, I would not only give my consent, I would attend the ceremony. What do you think of that? But what is true is that economists tend to have a purview that leaves out certain kinds of important things, particularly certain geopolitical and strategic realities that don't fit into the types of models or data or research and work that they are engaged in. So while, in terms of developing a real industrial policy, a serious industrial policy, while economists are an important tool for building a sound industrial policy, they aren't necessarily the best architects for that industrial policy. But getting back to, again, industrial policy in the past has tended to be focused on the sort of economic terrain defined by this picture. But the industrial policy we need to be talking about today is one that's focused on a very different terrain. It's this terrain. It's the terrain of high tech, of advanced technologies, and the world that is defined both in the present in terms of the internet, in terms of the digital age, digital telecommunications, and the future as well, whether we're talking about 5G, and we are going to talk about 5G, whether we're talking about artificial intelligence, talking about supercomputers, semiconductors, the whole range of an array of technologies that constitutes what we think of when we think of high tech. Now, in that sense, at first glance, the idea that we need an industrial policy to focus on high tech doesn't make sense. After all, the United States is certainly the leading giant in the high tech sector. Look at our biggest companies, right? Which are not only the biggest companies in high tech here in the United States, like Google, like Microsoft, like Apple, like Intel, the whole range of the others, but are also world giants, right? Bestride the globe like a colossus. These companies do, in their size and in their weight, and Amazon, for crying out loud. Think about that, the power, the global reach of a company of this sort. This would hardly seem to be the sector that needs focus for some sort of government intervention, let alone government correction or oversight, let alone any sort of government intervention as such. But what I want to suggest to you, and as I suggest in my article, is that there are certain problems. If we look deeper into that high-tech sector and into big tech, there are certain kinds of important issues that ought to raise some concern and alarm. From a point of view of, say, outside the realm of economists' purview, but thinking about it in terms of, let's say, national interest, in terms of national geopolitical strategic interest. The first is how much of the manufacturing that goes into the high-tech sector no longer takes place in the United States. That over the course of the decades, that the manufacturing ecosystem around which our high-tech companies are built has been outsourced. And that most of that capability is now built outside the United States. Smartphones, for example. There aren't American companies, not significant ones, that build smartphones anymore. High definition television screens. They're not made here anymore. The ones that are made for American companies are built somewhere else. Now you could say that's definitely bad news in terms of American jobs, but it also suggests a deeper problem as well, and that is the degree to which high-tech manufacturing, the supply chain, now depends upon sources outside the United States. In fact, some of them, like for example, China, that may in fact be directly antagonistic to American interests in the direction that they head. So this has been one problem, has been the degree to which America has lost the capacity to do high-tech manufacturing. The second problem is that so many of these companies, Google being a prime example, but not the only one, have are global businesses with a global agenda. And so when their business model confronts issues about what are our ties in China, for example, the fact that a lot of the manufactured products that we use are made outside the United States, made in countries like China, that these are all part of their larger global business plan, but not necessarily ones that serve American national interests, let alone strategic interests going forward here. And when they're asked to confront those issues and to deal with that kind of an issue, their initial response is resistance. Don't fool with our business plan, right? There's nothing wrong with the fact that we see big markets ahead and have strong, close economic ties with a country like China. That this is not a problem that they foresee in many ways, but which from the United States point of view are a problem. That when Google decides to build, for example, an artificial intelligence center, a major one, builds it in China using Chinese scientists, it raises a certain amount of alarm in Capitol Hill and the Pentagon, but from Google's point of view, it can all be explained away. This is nothing to worry about. Nothing to see here, move on. That's the second problem. And of course, all of these problems would remain rather theoretic concerns if it were not for the third issue, and that is the steady rise of China as America's not only economic and manufacturing competitor, but also as its geopolitical competitor. So that more and more of what it is that actually makes high tech is more and more made in factories like these in China, as opposed to the United States, and that the accompanying technologies that develop with that manufacturing base, the developments and innovation in terms of production, in terms of being able to develop and deploy new technologies, is more and more taking place outside the United States. And the case of Apple building its phones in China is a classic example of this, of the degree to which Apple has, in a sense, held its production lines becoming, as it were, held hostage to the relationship between US and China and being able to stay on the good side with China. And as recent developments there took place when the appalling conditions in Apple's factories in China developed, what happened was with the recent strike at the factory in China where they're making iPhones, did not redound very well to the credit of Apple itself as a company. And in this case, certainly we can say that the Apple's relationship with China not only hurts its reputation over here, but it also helps to tarnish its image over there. The other point to bear in mind about China with this is that its growth of its high-tech sector and developments here are part of a larger strategy. They are part of a strategy of which the Chinese are very transparent and very upfront, which is to displace the United States as the dominant superpower around the globe. That China's high-tech sector, which is surging and developing and in many cases surging ahead of us in certain areas, as for example, artificial intelligence. The details are in the article, so I'm not going to spell all this out for you. That as that sector surges, no bones are made about the fact that this is part of the Chinese military-industrial complex. And in fact, it helps to reinforce that military-industrial complex. That the Chinese have, through their strategy, overcome the age-old problem, which we still struggle with here. You can hear the debate from time to time. It begins to surface, which is, where is the federal government going to spend its money? In our economy, do we spend it on guns or butter, right? And you have to choose between guns and butter here. Well, what the Chinese have discovered, which is very clever of them, is that butter, especially high-tech butter, is guns. It lays the basis for future weapon systems as well as for an economic dominance, which becomes a platform for geopolitical power and geopolitical leverage in dealing with possible antagonists, and particularly with the United States here. So for the Chinese, this kind of development here, the Chinese military-industrial complex necessarily includes a strategy for advancing their high-tech industries and integrating them into the larger framework that is involved here. And in that process, its own military-industrial base continues to grow and surge ahead. Within 10 years, China's military spending will be 80% of the US's within 10 years. For a long time, when I would make these arguments in Capitol Hill and elsewhere about China's surging military spending, I was always told it's still a fraction of what ours is. It's a small percentage compared to the spending U.S. spending. Well, it won't be much longer. It won't be much longer. And from their standpoint, their economic dominance and power is also directly linked to their military power. Now, in our case, this has not really been sorted out. Our defense industrial base, far from keeping up with our development of our high-tech industries, has progressively and increasingly fallen behind. The most recent study done of the defense industrial base by the federal government shows appalling shortfalls in terms of where our defense industrial supply chain falls. That the number of American sources and suppliers for key parts and key components in our own defense and defense systems and weapons systems are all outsourced, in many cases, ironically enough, to China. It would be rather as if during World War II, our GIs were going into battle at Omaha Beach, right, with combat helmets and M1s manufactured in Germany. That's the kind of situation we're facing with the declining industrial base here, whether you're talking about in our shipyards, whether you're talking about land-based and airborne equipment, or whether you're talking about the high-tech systems of the future. We have a defense industrial base that is in serious crisis. And it's one in which the discrepancy between where we are in terms of our high-tech capabilities and capacities, where we are in our defense systems, couldn't be greater and couldn't be more enormous. Now, all of these issues have come to a head, I think, very recently now with the issue about 5G wireless technology and the dominant role that the Chinese telecom equipment giant, the biggest telecom equipment builder in the world, Huawei, has come to play in this drama. And the increasing alarm on the part of Washington policymakers, but also of intelligence agencies and defense agencies around the world, of the ease with which and the speed with which Huawei, a company with deep ties to the Chinese military-industrial complex and intelligence complex, has been able to secure contracts for building and equipping the future high 5G infrastructure around the world, including with leading US allies. And despite US warnings, despite US attempts to ban Huawei products in the United States, to get our allies to consider and adopt a ban on Huawei equipment, saying it is insecure, it can't be trusted, particularly with an advanced technology which touches on Internet of Things the way 5G was. Well, what we've seen is that the response has been hesitation, skepticism about American claims, but also a tendency on the part of even allies to throw up their hands and say, give us an alternative. Why, if we can't go with Huawei, who are we going to go with? And this has been a challenge. What I see when I look at the 5G debate right now in Washington is I see a lot of energy on the part of different government agencies, including the Department of Defense, that this is a serious problem, something has to be done about it. But what I don't see is a lot of coordination of effort, and a lot of effort particularly to approach the private companies that will be integral and pivotal to the development of 5G technology, to find a coherent strategy as a way in which to counter Huawei's efforts here. So lots of energy going in lots of different directions, but not much direction in otherwise. Which is why when you look at the map of the world now and Huawei's advances, it becomes increasingly clear that Huawei is still on the move, still recruiting companies for this in development. And that the United States, despite all of our geopolitical leverage with allies and others, hasn't really found a way in which to stop it, let alone to develop an alternative to that Huawei advance. And what I want to suggest to you is that the Huawei case is a microcosm of this much larger problem, of the fact that the Chinese have a comprehensive strategy and use their government resources to achieve that strategy, by which their defense industrial base, their high-tech base, their economic growth, and also their geopolitical reach are all seen as part of a single movement and direction. So the question then is, what does the US do about it? If we need an industrial policy, if we need to develop a coherent strategy, how do we do it? If there are so many examples of failed industrial policy, where do we look for a policy that is successful? Well, what I want to suggest to you is that when I published the book, Freedom's Forge, in 2012, that contained within it, with its picture of how American business, as the subtitle says, how American business produced victory in World War II, that the story of the building of the arsenal democracy offers a key paradigm for how you develop a successful industrial policy today as well as in 1940. And that although circumstances have changed and the world looks different, and many of the technologies, not most of them, are very different from the ones that prevailed in 1940 as opposed to today. And even though in 1940 an industrial policy that was implemented as part of mobilization for the war effort was a sweeping one that touched every aspect of the American economy and every consumer, and that an industrial policy of the kind that we're talking about to solve the problems which are much more limited, require far fewer devotion of resources, and would be much easier in terms of coordination among the key players and the key factors in this development, that we can, from the experience in World War II, from the experience of the building of the arsenal of democracy, we can derive principles for building a future arsenal of democracy. And I want to, and here for the remainder of the time that I've got with you, I want to spell out very briefly the 6 principles that I see embedded in the story of the arsenal of democracy in World War II that can apply to an industrial policy and are pertinent to developing such a one today. The first one is define the challenge, define the threat. This has been a problem with some of the other industrial policy plans that have been developed, is that they've been conceived of in very vague terms in terms of increasing the number of jobs, getting more exports, saving American manufacturing. World War II, the object was clear, the threat was clear, and the challenge, the objectives were very clear and straightforward from the very beginning. And that objective, by the way, was not to defeat Germany and Japan. Although, of course, that's what became the objective. But the real objective in 1940, not 1941, but 1940, when the mobilization for war really began, when Roosevelt reached out and set in motion American industry to begin to gear up to fight a modern warfare, the objective was not to defeat Germany or Japan. We weren't at war. The objective was to keep Britain in the war against the Nazis after the fall of France, that there was a vital U.S. interest in keeping Britain alive, keeping it supplied with the war equipment that it would need in order to hold off the Nazis. That was it. And the American factories mobilized for war in order to fill contracts for British defense. Now, in the process, of course, what happened is that by converting factories to wartime production for Britain, that also eased the process for conversion to wartime production for American armed services when war did come. And this is one of the other things I think is important to realize from an historical point of view, is that the mobilization of war did not begin with the dropping of bombs on Pearl Harbor. It began a year and a half before that, when Roosevelt realized that America's national interest, vital interest, was to keep Britain from falling into the hands of Nazi Germany, and that Britain win the Battle of Britain. That was fundamental, and that set in motion the direction that it took place. Successful industrial policies, in my mind, are geared towards a specific target, specific issue. Take the semiconductor industry. When the US realized that Japan was eating our lunch in the semiconductor industry, it moved in and said to the companies, semiconductor manufacturers, you guys are going to have to get together and figure out how you're going to share IP so that we can pool resources and develop it, because we've got to beat Japan and hold on to our semiconductor industry and not let it go offshore like that. And they created Sematech, the public-private partnership, in order to do that and sustain it. And it was a huge success. As a matter of fact, the main reason why the one part of high-tech manufacturing is still here, semiconductors, is because of an industrial policy, because the industrial policy approach the federal government took in the 1980s to create Sematech. So that's number one. Define the challenge, define the threat. Number two, find the right talent to build a strategy. This is what Roosevelt did. When he needed an industrial plan to mobilize for war, he didn't talk to economists. He talked to manufacturers, industrial leaders like Bill Knudsen, the CEO of General Motors, and Henry Ford, CEO of Ford Motor Company. And Bill Knudsen said to him, look, if you want to mobilize for war, to fight a modern war against Germany, Japan hadn't even appeared on the horizon in the summer of 1940 yet. He said, I'll tell you what, give me 18 months to mobilize my fellow industrialists. We'll work out the plan. We'll figure out where the key aspects of military mobilization need to be in terms of our productive capacity. Give me 18 months, and I'll give you more war material than you can handle. And Roosevelt said, do it. And it worked, because the 18 months came, that That's why when bombs do drop on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States is ready to go and ready to fight that conflict. We had, that 18 months, business had taken over the job of figuring out how to do it, where resources needed to go, and had turned to the best talents, the best companies, and best leadership within the corporate world in order to figure out how to do it and carry it forward. Then the third principle, which was very much the case during the arsenal of democracy, the building of the war effort during World War II, spread the effort. Get as many companies involved as possible in the development. This was Knudsen's great insight, that you could mobilize the most productive companies in America to produce war material, even if they had never produced a weapon in their lives. You could do it because they would have the know-how, the engineering know-how, they would have the assembly line capacity to do things that would make the United States overflow with war material in ways that would overwhelm the Axis, the forces that we were facing in all this. So far from limiting the building of war material to armaments companies like Remington and Winchester, of course they were important, of course they were involved, but they were by no means in the lead. It was the most productive companies in whatever sector that were involved who became the key in developments in this. The most important of those breakthroughs, by the way, came with the development of the most potent weapon of the American arsenal of democracy of all, the atomic bomb. No one ever made such a thing before. No one had ever seen such a thing turn from basically a science experiment into the most powerful and devastating weapon in human history, so on. But the government had the insight to turn to the companies that they felt could make that. DuPont, Monsanto, Allied chemical companies. They were used to handling toxic materials. Everybody knew this bomb was going to be really toxic. Whatever else came out of it, it would be really dangerous materials you'd be handling. So you turn to those who knew how to handle dangerous materials. And they did. And they were able to build not one, but 2 atomic bombs in order to end the war in that process. Now that's a big example of how you can spread the effort even to those who've never done it before. Let me give you real quickly a smaller sample. And that's the company called Rockola. It's a jukebox company based out of Chicago. They had an important regional presence making jukeboxes. And the president of, when war came, the president of Rockola saw that government was looking for contracts to produce M1 carbines. Now that's interesting because this is a case where the government didn't say, Rockola, you are going to make M1 carbines, right? That's the Chinese style of doing things. You have talent, we want that talent, you're going to do this. It was a volunteer effort. The whole arsenal of democracy was built on volunteerism, incentivizing those who can to do. And so the president of Rockola said, we could do that. We could make M1 carbines. They're probably not going to sell a lot of jukeboxes during the war anyway, so why don't we do it this way? So they did. They got the contract and they made M1 carbines, thousands of them. You can still buy them on eBay, as a matter of fact. For gun collectors, the M1 carbine manufactured by Rockola, it's a collector's item. Likewise, the ones manufactured by National Postage Meter. Likewise, the ones manufactured by Remington Typewriter. They didn't know anything about making guns, but they knew how to make stuff. They knew how to turn an assembly line into something to produce thousands of these things. And that's what Rockola did. And then when the war was over, when Rockola switched back to civilian production, guess what? They had learned a lot about productivity. They had learned a lot about how to streamline and make a more effective assembly line. And after the war, Rockola became not just a regional jukebox maker, but a national jukebox maker. They became the direct challenger to the biggest jukebox maker in America. That was Wurlitzer, mighty Wurlitzer, right? And so Rockola jukeboxes became ubiquitous in American cafes and restaurants and diners all over the place. The Rockola jukebox, and with it, of course, the new music that was being played on these things in the 1950s, you know, by people like Elvis Presley and so on. And that is why the music that was played in the 1950s on these jukeboxes becomes known as rock and roll. Rock and roll is a corruption of Rockola, the name of the company for the jukeboxes that came out of this. Unintended consequences that come from being able to mobilize those who Don't make something and to make something else. Now, what am I saying? Am I saying that somebody that, for example, a lawnmower company should be making components for 5G, right? Am I going that far? No, not necessarily. But it is important to think outside the box when you're beginning to move into these into high-tech areas about what's possible and what can be done. Then the fourth principle, keep noses pointed in the same direction. This is what Bill Knudsen emphasized all the way through. Our job in dealing with business is not to spend all of our time telling them what to do and what to produce and where, et cetera. Is to make sure all the effort is in the same direction, headed towards the same strategic goals, the same target, our number one principle. That's government's role in all this. And oversight to make sure that everyone is making their maximum effort in that direction. And if they aren't, if they're failing it, if they're doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing, then the hammer comes down, contracts are gone, we'll find somebody else who can do it. Keeping the noses pointed in the same direction. That was government's key role during World War II, incentivizing those who could to produce, punishing those who said they could but couldn't and wouldn't. And then the fifth principle, devise an exit strategy. This, I think, is hugely important, is that an industrial policy and plan have an end point. Once you've achieved your target, you break off. The role of the government drops out, and we go back to business as normal. Business transformed, as we saw in the case of Rockola. Rockola is a different company when it came out of the war. But the point is, the government role drops out, the private market takes over. Now here we have to deal with a misconception. The end point, the exit strategy did not come, and the stopping of the mobilization war did not come with VJ Day in the end of the war. It was, in fact, by the spring of 1944, it became clear to the government overseers of this war mobilization effort that the problem that they were going to face was not how to keep the system going or growing, it was how to stop it. The productivity from American factories and companies was so great, the output, by summer of 1944, okay, American shipyards are producing 8 aircraft carriers a month. 8. Anyone here from Huntington Ingalls, by any chance? Know anything about that? 8 aircraft carriers. By the summer of 1940, it was clear America was going to win this war. The Allies were going to win. How do you stop this thing? And so the gear up for the War Production Board became not producing more, but slowing the machine down and making a smooth transition back to civilian production. And what became known as T-Day, Terminal Day, the day in which your company was going to end its government contract and began the process of reverting back to civilian production, became the big obsession in the summer of 1944. Everybody else, the public is thinking about D-Day. Companies, manufacturers are thinking about T-Day because the future of their companies depend upon making that transition and getting their workers back to civilian production after that. That is one of the key aspects of it. Set the target, hit the target, get out for government's role in these matters. And then the sixth and last one, find the right leadership. This is really crucial to it. In World War II, we did. We had FDR, who took on the responsibility, the personal responsibility of leading that effort. When Sputnik was launched in 1957, that leadership role descended on President Eisenhower. Eisenhower, who had seen firsthand and experienced firsthand the growth and the expansion of this effort during the war, of an industrial plan and an industrial policy that had achieved victory here. He was able to push for an all-of-government effort in getting back into the space race and competing with the Soviet Union in this important larger goal and mobilizing the scientific and engineering talent to achieve it at the same time. And then likewise, too, with the race to the moon, the role that President Kennedy will play here in becoming the personal symbol of, through his youthful vigor, his push for this dream and idea, the personal embodiment of this kind of plan and the mobilization of American resources. And it's important to always remember when we think about Kennedy and the space race, that every day in every way he faced constant opposition both outside and inside his government to the space race and the energy and the resources being devoted to it. Waste of time, a waste of money. Don't you know our rockets always blow up? Don't get caught up in these kinds of things. Constant criticism, constant opposition, which he bowled through and pushed through at every step of the way. An industrial plan to deal with a comprehensive strategy to deal with China needs leadership. And leadership, I don't mean just in presidential leadership or even just political leadership. I mean industrial leadership. There has to be, we have to find the people, the person or the people who will embody that effort and to say America will win this race. America will not lose its high-tech leadership, will not lose its defense industrial base, and that we are going to devote the resources and we're going to devote the energies and pool the talent and ability to make that happen. Because if the stakes were huge during World War II and the stakes were huge during the Cold War in these races and in these efforts, I think it's becoming increasingly clear to people the stakes are perhaps equally huge in a, not just a geopolitical, but a moral sense in the competition with China. That if China, where do you go? Can I get my last slide back? One more, there we are. That if China wins, if we don't do anything, the future of a world dominated by Chinese technology is a rather bleak one. It's a bleak one of the use of facial recognition technology through AI in order to enforce the total surveillance state, to enforce social credits, to punish those who dare to criticize or don't praise the system by the use of these kinds of technologies. What we've seen played out in Hong Kong over these last 6 months, and we're now at the 6-month anniversary of those protests, I think has heightened that sense of the contrast between the two systems, between the two choices that we face in ways that have become clear, not just to Americans, but to around the world here as well. But in the end, the terrain on which this will be fought, the terrain in which these issues will be decided is not going to be in Hong Kong. It's going to be, again, back to the American economy, in the American economic landscape. But where we focus our attention, where we focus our resources, and where that effort and commitment falls is going to be crucial for going forward for the 21st century and where we're headed. I think we've got a good model. I think we've got the talent and the ability to do it. It's just a question now of the will and the leadership to make it happen. I'm done. Thank you.
Well, Arthur, you're not quite done.
Oh.
I want to just make one point and then turn to Julius. What I like about your paper, and where I think it's an important step, is that in the last couple of years, the debates over government's new role in the economy, over industrial policy, has been very abstract. And it's been, well, we've had this world in America where policy has been libertarian and free market, and we have to get away from that and have an active role in the economy. But in fact, many of America's major economic sectors are pervasively controlled by the government. Communications, energy, finance,
right,
healthcare, agriculture. So regulation, industrial policy by sectors is actually something we're quite familiar with.
It's the current landscape today.
That's the landscape today. But most of these have to do with consumer protection or redistribution or subsidizing politically effective groups and so forth. And what you're saying is we want to get beyond that. We want to have an involvement where there is a unifying national purpose, and we're engaged in outright promotion with a defined goal. So you've moved the debate from regulation to mobilization. Americans, in my view, don't do government very well. We're not that good at regulation, but we've proven very good at mobilization, and you're drawing attention to something that we have a proven strength. However, your example is a wartime example, and that is the problem in translating it to today. in my view. In the account of your book, national unity was there, and the government was availing itself of that unity rather than causing it. Now, it did a good job. If FDR had turned to his brain trusters and said, mobilize the economy for war,
Well, they had lots of ideas.
we'd all be speaking German right now. But he had the good sense to call up Knudsen and get the business people directly involved over the objections of his intellectual cadre in the White House. So that, I think, is a very good model. And there are others. The moonshot, the interstate highway system could be another one. But even in the 50s, even in the 60s, we were a more united country than we are today. And we're quite fractured right now. And I try to, if I'm the president, who does the president call? Who's going to be his Knudsen? Is it going to be Tim Cook? Is it going to be Sandor Pichai? Is it going to be Mark Zuckerberg? I can't imagine any of them leading an overtly nationalist effort. Things might change. If China began closing off its consumer market to Americans. On the other hand, the project of real-time surveillance of 2 billion people, that's a big government program, and there's a lot of business for Google in that. And how do we turn their attentions to the United States seems to me to be a huge dilemma.
Yeah, it does, and your last point is very well taken. I think there are right now certain candidates from the high-tech industry who could see themselves playing that role. But the real question is, and the one that you really put your finger on, is the one I actually sort of began with, and that is that our big tech companies have a business model that's shaped by different assumptions and different agenda than the one that would drive us in terms of a national interest approach. This is where the issue of industrial policy plus new nationalism comes in as an important aspect of where we need to be headed and where we need to go. Now, I think there are some big tech executives who are beginning to understand that and beginning to understand that the larger global agenda that they had built their businesses on may not actually be so good, not only for their relationship here in the United States, but also ultimately for their relationship with China. I am going to disagree with you on one little point, though, and that is with regard to where we were in terms of national unity in wartime. When the book starts, when in fact mobilization begins, we aren't at war. It's the summer of 1940. In fact, the division between isolationists and those who were called war hawks, who wanted a more active intervention on the part of Britain, was very intense. There was considerable polarization among the political parties, Republicans against Democrats on many of these key issues. And in fact, the mobilization that Knudsen and Roosevelt undertake isn't really cashing in on the war. It is preparing for it, of which there was considerable skepticism. But the fact is that Knudsen himself had such credit within the business community, particularly among his fellow auto executives, but also in the whole number of industries that were involved in the automotive supply chain who had dealt directly with Knudsen, that when he said, we've got to get ready, we've got to keep Britain in the war, we've got to get ready for our own military buildup and for our own military capacity going forward here. Even isolationist Republican executives said, I can't stand Roosevelt, I think it's a big mistake, but Bill, you tell me what you want me to do and I'll do it. He was able to cash in on that personal credibility, on that ability. And I think that the growing sense that that this is not 1941 with China, it's not even 1940. You know, it might be 1938. It might be at that moment where the US realizes that this is, in fact, we are facing a competition and a confrontation here that's going to require mobilization of efforts on a scale not as large as the one I described in Freedom's Forge, but one that can, if necessary, set the stage for such a mobilization when it comes.
Thank you. Let's turn to your editor, Julius Krein. Julius, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'll maybe begin on a lighter note by noting that I was not aware of the Rockola story. And I'd just like to add that, in fact, the popular South Korean genre of music, K-pop, can also be directly traced to Korea's industrial policy. So not only is it capable...
That's an important point.
Not only is it capable of producing 8 aircraft carriers a month, but 2 genres of popular music.
Love it, love it.
But I think it's actually a deeper... maybe it points to something a bit deeper, which is when people talk about national unity, a lot of people think national unity comes from academics or politicians making nice speeches. But I do think, I'm not reducing everything to economics, but part of it is built by being part of and mobilized in a national project. So it's not clear to me that something like this, national unity, is simply a precondition of something like this. It may actually be an outcome, more of an outcome. But for those of you who haven't had time to read the full article that Arthur wrote for us, I encourage you to do that. By way of some background, American Affairs is a quarterly journal, and really since we started 3 years ago, industrial policy has been a primary focus of ours. We probably have 3 articles or so, at least in every issue, focused on this. I hope that someday it will just become conventional wisdom and common knowledge and we can move on to something else, but my sense is that we'll be publishing several articles on this for many years to come, so please check that out. The other thing I would add, I think that to me, one of the differences from the pre-World War II and World War II mobilization era is actually the many decades of underinvestment, both in the U.S. industrial base itself, in research and development, other technologies, the loss actually of a lot of the corporate research technology, things like Bell Labs, RCA Labs, not even there anymore. And it's really a much larger problem at the heart of the current market incentives and financial incentives in the U.S. business community, which in many ways result from what China has been doing. Effectively, what the U.S. does is we allow China to subsidize our production, and we take the benefit in the form basically of higher stock prices, mainly by underinvesting in our own production and doing more things like share buybacks and other forms of financial engineering. And in the short term, this makes perfect sense, and people, benefit from it. Large capital holders mainly, consumers a little bit. But in the long term, of course, you are completely eroding not only your industrial base, but your capacity for future innovation and ability to compete in these high-tech industries of the future. My favorite example of this, perhaps, is Boeing. Boeing outsourced a lot of its design to Japan. Its software went to India. It moved a significant portion of its manufacturing overseas. And what did it actually do with these savings? Did it invest in some new, exciting technology? No, it did tens of billions of dollars of share buybacks and capital distribution, and as a result, it can no longer produce a plane that can fly. I think that's really, you can go down the list from IBM to GE, countless American national champions, basically progressively in decline, even as their shareholders have reaped the rewards of the current incentives. And I think that fundamentally needs to be changed. I think Marco Rubio's office has done 2 reports in the last year or so, one directly on China, one on the investment issues, which address that in the time and space that it deserves. And the other final point I would make is looking at that map of Huawei. What's striking about our celebration of Silicon Valley and Google and Amazon and all of that is how politically dependent these companies are. Google, for all that it has done in China, is a very small player in China. Apple is falling market share in China. Amazon is not a player in China. You can go down the list. Same thing in Russia. Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, they're not players there. I actually had a friend in the finance industry who did a study looking at whenever the U.S. and Europe had some kind of diplomatic contretemps, it almost certainly followed that a European government would go after Google or whatever for a data privacy violation and that sort of thing. These companies, all these social network businesses, because they're social network businesses, are incredibly politically sensitive. And when you look at that map up there and you see when Huawei and so on is going to be providing 5G to the world, it's not going to happen overnight, but I think you actually, even those leading Silicon Valley businesses start to appear very vulnerable as China moves up the value chain and leverages its position in some of the less high margin businesses like 5G components. And pretty soon you'll be talking about Alibaba and WeChat and so on. So if the tech industry, they haven't gotten there yet, but as Arthur pointed out, I think more and more of the executives are starting to slowly figure it out. And hopefully they'll figure it out sooner rather than later.
Yeah, you raised a couple of interesting points which I think are worth emphasizing. One is the financial development you're talking about of companies that don't, in a sense, reinvest in new products or innovation in products. It's not an issue during World War II. It was always understood that if you were at Ford, if you were at GM, if you were at Timken, whatever it is you were doing manufacturing, your business was manufacturing. And that was how you made your profits. That's how you kept your workers at work. And that was how you took care of your shareholders. That wasn't that primary focus on what's Wall Street going to do or what's the NASDAQ numbers going to look like if we make these decisions. The other one, which I think is a very important one, which I don't want to neglect, and it comes back to Chris's point about what's the differences. How is the terrain different from 1940 today? And that is the issue of supply chain. That in 1940, American companies and the US government could count on a supply chain which was all basically contained within the 48 states. And therefore, if you needed to get parts and components for a Sherman tank or for a B-24 or for anything else that you were making, it was going to be an American maker, an American manufacturer, American company you'd turn to for it. We don't have that anymore. Today, we live in a world of global supply chains. And so when I have that third principle up there, spread the effort, that means spread the effort not just in the United States, but also overseas. You're going to have to do that. You're going to have to look to and find your closest allies to be part of that ongoing supply chain. And they exist, and they're there. But building a global supply chain among allies is going to be fundamental both to reviving and restoring our defense industrial base, but also recovering our sense of direction and our center of gravity when it comes to our high-tech manufacturing base as well. And one of the main points to come out of this, which I think is an issue that we have talked about here and is an important theme, I think, in other articles that have appeared in American Affairs, is that, in fact, through manufacturing and the production process, big innovations can come. Innovation isn't just the product of, a couple of people in a room doing a startup company. It's something that comes through the manufacturing process, the production process, new ideas, new ways of doing things, even new products emerge from this. And by limiting and cutting out, I'm going to change that. By outsourcing so much of our manufacturing base in high tech, we miss out on those opportunities. We've missed out on those opportunities for American engineers and managers to try new ways of doing things, finding shortcuts that work and produce things cheaper and faster in the process. But we can tap into that talent that already exists outside the United States among our allies at the same time, whether you're talking about Japan, you're talking about South Korea, talking about Europe, Australia, and elsewhere, that spread the effort now has to include our allies. The arsenal of democracy must become an arsenal of democracies if it's going to succeed, and if the U.S. is going to maintain that position of leadership.
But Arthur, in World War II, here's another distinction.
Sure.
We were mobilizing to build the machinery of war. Okay, as you point out, today high-tech butter it's a different sort of thing. so that if one of the goals of the Arthur Herman domestic mobilization of 2020 was to have a Western equivalent of Huawei that was better, okay? Mainly, it's going to be providing infrastructure for consumer, faster Netflix, so forth. That's a little bit different than aircraft carriers and
yeah, it is to
parachutes and so forth.
To a certain degree, but
How do we go about creating this technological competitor in the West?
well, let me back up for 1 second. That the World War II buildup appears low tech only in retrospect. That we have to remember how much of what was in fact employed during that war, particularly coming out of American factories, was in many cases stuff that no one had ever developed before, ever built before. Whether you're talking about advanced aircraft engines, whether you're talking about complex weapon systems, not just, of course, the atomic bomb, but also the B-29. It involved a lot of technologies that had never existed before, that had to be turned from engineering drawings into production line reality. High-tech in 1940 terms, just as we talk about high-tech today. Now, the issue that you're also touching on, which is also very profound, and I'm glad you brought it up too, is the issue of how many of the technologies on which present and future weapons systems used by our services are essentially commercial technologies, which our Department of Defense has attempted to approach in a couple of ways. One is by looking for ways in which they can buy those technologies off the shelf. So COTS technology becomes an important part of how DoD thinks about the equipment that its soldiers or sailors or air people, are they called air people now instead of airmen? Air people need in order to perform their mission, perform their tasks. And it's also, and in here, I'll give credit to the Defense Department, the Obama Defense Department. It was also to try and develop the first of my principles that I talked about, which was to reach out to the right kinds of leaders to develop a high-tech strategy for the Pentagon. This is what was called the third offset. The third offset looking for, turning to companies like Google, as a matter of fact, to sort of say, if we're going to build high-tech systems that we're going to need in order to compete with China, but also Russia, how we do that? You build them on a commercial basis. Tell us what's the best way to develop these on a military basis. Mm-hmm. I don't think it worked out terribly well. And I think there were a number of reasons why the third offset strategy, as it was called, had problems. If we were to do an analysis as to why it wasn't as successful as its progenitors, Frank Kendall and Bob Work. I don't think they're here in the room, but some of you may know them. I think there was a really grand idea and a grand concept, but I think they, first of all, went to the wrong people. I don't think Google is going to tell you how to win a war with China, number one. But I think they also didn't think about it in terms of the strategy has to develop by those who understand strategy. And then you go to the companies and technology companies and say, this is what we need. You go ahead and now show us how you build it, which is what we did in World War II.
I would just add to that, Michael Lind pointed this out to me. There's actually a very direct analog to the 5G situation, and that was the creation of RCA. At the time, the only provider was Marconi, which was an Italian company, and the U.S. government, defense, Navy mostly, created RCA. So there are a lot of precedents for these things, even within our own history.
That's right, and not just the arsenal of democracy, but in the World War II experience, but RCA is a good example. ARPANET, Internet, is another. Development of the railroads, interstate. You mentioned the interstate. There's plenty of examples of this kind of this approach that the federal government is able to take in order to mobilize resources, and particularly in how to make things that are essential to national interest, that can be very successful. But I think if you go through them, the history of these experiences, and then go through the checklist of my 6 principles, I think a lot of those same principles will surface in those stories and those accounts as well.
We're going to turn to questions, comments from everyone in the room. I will call on you if you have something that you would like to ask of Arthur or make a comment. If you would please wait until the roving microphone arrives, and if you'd begin by introducing yourself. Thank you.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. And first of all, great presentation, Arthur.
Thank you.
My name is Jose Ocasio-Christian. I'm with Kalis Partners. And
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that again.
Jose Ocasio-Christian, I'm with Kalis Partners. And we study a lot of this, the case for industrial policy and the Chinese threat. And in particular with that, you mentioned that in history, we've had the key leaders from above being able to bring that. If I was the threat, meaning the Chinese, I would have read our history and I would have figured out ways so that you could not unify the country so that you could get the leaders to mobilize and execute industrial policy. So with that in mind, have you considered any other applications that are not necessarily from the highest levels of our government or highest levels of industry and say, is there a bottom-up way that you could mobilize as you're trying to do? Remember, the threat already knows that you have a history of mobilizing the industry through the national government. So they're gonna try to, and you can see today that you're gonna have a difference of opinion. So how do you get around that? Is there any other ways that you thought of in all this great work that tells us maybe there's another way to approach it for applications?
That's a really interesting question. And it's not one that I address specifically in the article. It's just not the problem that I think needs to be addressed right now. Nor is it one in which answers immediately spring to mind, particularly when we're talking about, the central issue here is the issue of what's the role of the federal government. So that role necessarily is one that falls on federal government leaders, if that's the discussion. If we're talking about a broader based kind of effort with this, I think that could be an interesting problem, but it's not the one that I addressed here. And I don't think it's the one that really constitutes the best possible use for the resources that sit over here, whether it's on Capitol Hill or in the White House or across in the Pentagon. It's trying to get those guys and gals to think about what needs to be done here and what needs to be mobilized, if I'm taking your question the correct way.
Sure you are, but the issue becomes no one disagrees with the case for U.S. industrial policy. I think the more important question is, what is the applications within the Chinese threat to developing those policies? I'm agreeing with you.
You'll just have to read my next article, won't you?
Well, that's a bit curious.
Yeah, I can make a quick comment. I did find one of the interesting things is that China, one of the things they have liberalized is financial sector stuff, which disproportionately benefits the U.S. financial sector, which in general, though it's not inherently an opponent to what we're talking about, it certainly has been and continues to be, and it honestly wouldn't surprise me if the Chinese had thought about that when they decided to do some of that liberalization.
You're next.
Hi, I'm Andrew Reamer. I'm a professor of public policy at George Washington University and focus on industrial competitiveness. I want to talk a bit about the system of economic statistics that helps us monitor U.S. competitiveness. Interestingly, in the 19th century, the Congress was very interested in developing the statistics to be able to set the tariffs. And so you find that the roots of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the economic side of the Census Bureau all come from industrial policy in the 19th century. That changed during World War II because macroeconomics and Keynesian economics and GDP measurement took over. And so they all got out of the business. As a result, there is nobody in the federal government that is able to monitor the competitiveness of key U.S. industries and understand the competitive strengths and weaknesses, and in particular, track supply chains, right? That there is an effort a very slow-moving effort to create statistics of what's called trade and value added. So you can look at the country-by-country content of an Apple iPhone in the statistics. And Trump is doing industrial policy through tariffs. Well, what we don't know is what the U.S. content is of imports. So the question for all three of you really is, what improvements would you like to see in the federal economic statistics system that will allow both the public and the private sector to monitor competitiveness?
It's a great point, first of all. And if you'd like to write an article about it, let me know. Because it's not, people don't pay enough attention to it. I haven't given personally a great deal of thought directly to the statistics area of the government. I think there has been a bit of thought more broadly on reorganizing the agencies to focus both on, right now our economics infrastructure, agency infrastructure is purely sort of thinks in terms of GDP and internal and doesn't think at all in terms of foreign policy or geoeconomic competition. We have published a few articles on that broader problem, but not on the statistics one in particular. The only people that I'm aware of who really pay attention to this stuff are people like Willie Shih at Harvard Business School. Sridhar Kota does a little bit of work on it, but for the most part, it hasn't been a priority, and it's something that absolutely needs to be done. I agree.
That's great.
I'm familiar with this problem, not so much from a statistical point of view, but from the supply chain point of view with DoD. Because a lot of the work that's being done by programs there, the manufacturing technology institutes, and also the industrial base assessment and sustainment program, one of the big assignments that they have, and one of the big problems actually they have, is precisely measuring supply chain and getting a sense of not just foreign content, but where the US content can come from. What this recent study by the Office of Manufacturing and Technology Policy, the one I'd referred to earlier about just how weak and how unsustainable the US industrial base has become, is the degree to which critical components for weapon systems have now come down to a single supplier, single US supplier. If he goes underwater, if she goes underwater, or decides I'm not going to do work with the government any longer, even the big defense contractors don't know where the next supply is going to come from for these kinds of parts and elements here. So this is what you're talking about, is an understanding of the role of where the components come from, foreign sources, domestic sources. This is fundamental, not just on the issue about trade, let's say, and our relations with our own country. We don't really have an adequate way in which to track that right now at DoD. And it's one of the things that they've been looking for and trying to figure out how to do that, because even their biggest contractors are kind of in the dark about where current supply chain comes from. I mean, they know their current suppliers are, but who to call if the other company doesn't do it anymore? It's an enormous challenge. And one of the advantages of course, of working with a foreign country is that you can count on supply of these components here in a way in which you don't really know who in the US might be able to help you out. And if that supplier happens to be a Chinese company, well.
Gentlemen, I have 5 easy questions. My name is Neil Garver. I'm a finance analyst at the medical university locally, and I'm also an information specialist at the Smithsonian at 12 of their locations. Thank you. Thank you, by the way, your presentation was exceptional. Let's assume that in the near future, China's high-tech manufacturing is approximately 80% of the US manufacturing. What's to say that 80% of what's manufactured in China does not exceed 100 or 110% of what's manufactured in the US? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is also easy. How many US cities have functional 5G infrastructures? Question number 3, how many Chinese cities have functional 5G networks? Question number 4, how many US companies are currently manufacturing smartphones that are really 5G? And question number, the last question, how many US companies are currently manufacturing real 5G smartphones?
Well, those are easy for you to ask. Then I think that maybe, since you have us at a disadvantage, it'd be best for you to come up with 3 answers.
Well, the first one is for you. That I don't know the answer to that. Whether the value of the dollar that we put in, our $1 billion, and their $800 billion in their currency is greater, whether they get more out of that dollar than we get out of our dollar. That question's for you.
Yeah.
I can answer the other.
You can answer the other ones. I think the matter of comparative analysis like that, of course, is very difficult to figure out. It depends on a range of statistical issues that I am not averse to deal with at this moment. What I would say, however, is that I will answer your question this way: is that when we come to the question of economic competitiveness of U.S. versus China, right? In the context of geopolitical rivalry, okay? That in World War II, Japan's manufacturing capacity was about 15% of the United States. Germany's was about 30%. Today, China's manufacturing capacity vis-a-vis the United States is about 60%. So the question of which country is it going to be, which is going to be a more formidable opponent in the case of mobilization for war, I think it's pretty clear that we're dealing with China. We're playing at a very different level than we were at World War II, which is why the issue of how you prepare for either such a conflict or rebuild your manufacturing base so you can have confidence that you can deal with it becomes ever more critical under those circumstances. And now, I'm going to call on you to give us the answer to the other question.
I'll take a crack. I mean, I would say if you had a situation where the U.S., if over the long term the U.S. is at 80% of China, that'll be, frankly, a massive victory. The situation is far worse than that. And in most of these key areas, China is spending 10 to 100 times what the U.S. is spending on some of these things.
Yeah, quantum technology, for example, that's certainly an applicable statistic.
You're correct. I totally absolutely. To answer the other question, which are strictly numbers that were put out by CSIS before I returned from my last trip, which was 2 weeks ago. The U.S. has, they report they have functional 5G cities. CSIS says there are none. China reports that they have 30 cities that are functionally 5G. Whether they're true or not, I can't say that. But that's what CSIS said at a conference very much like this, focusing on cyber threat and cybersecurity. The U.S. manufactures 0 5G phones, even though it shows up in the
That I'm not surprised about.
there are none. However, China manufactures 10 at various price points. Apple's not manufacturing one. They're manufacturing a high price point, and they're manufacturing a phone that will be 5G active in the 5G region for about $80.
Okay.
Oh, well, thank you for adding to our dismal mood on all of these issues.
We have a
I
question.
appreciate
We have a
it.
question right here. This gentleman here. Here you go.
Thank you very much. Garrett Ziegler, I'm a policy analyst at the White House. My question for you concerns your point, Dr. Herman, about marshaling political support, the people who actually have the statutory and other authorities to act on these problems. I've noticed that even if we, and my boss was actually the author, with a little bit of staff help of that report you alluded to, and we can get the right people to DOD, we can get the right people to the White House, maybe even a Senate staffer or two, Caleb, or who wrote that speech you alluded to at the beginning. at the DIU yesterday. But my question to you is, how do you marshal sort of milquetoast, and this is, I guess, on the record, but how do you marshal milquetoast Republican politicians? I personally come from a blue dog Democrat persuasion, sort of akin to Dick Gephardt. And what seems to me is we can write the reports, we can tell Congress this is a problem. The U.S.-China Security and Review Commission can write a 200-page report every single year, but unless there is serious appropriations, even more than we need, which would be very unique for the Republican Party. How do we get those funds? How do you my question is, can you sort of lead a movement in the think tank community, Cato, God forbid, you, other people, to sort of lobby the Republican politicians to give us the funds to then go marshal industry? Because in my opinion, it's going to take a huge national project, and I'm just wanting your, Julius, Arthur, and Chris's thoughts on that. How do you convince these Republicans who have not thought this way and who are maybe going to lose the empire because of it?
Well, I don't know. I guess I tend to be an optimist. I would say the first thing they must do is to read my article. The second thing they must do is read Freedom's Forge, and then to think about. I think, in a more serious vein, I think as the issue, the growing sense that China really does represent an important threat, not just the United States, but to freedom and democracy as a whole, that you'll be able to wean them away from the older delusions about what our relationship with China consisted of and where it was going, which was ultimately a kind of convergence model. And I think that as that sentiment begins to take hold, as it is doing now, I mean, thank God for the NBA. You know, I mean, that whole incident has done, I think, more to raise people's consciousness about just what dependence upon China really can do to and to distort American values in an American institution like the NBA. Thank God for Hong Kong. I think it's also done a huge amount to sort of, again, raise an awareness of the juxtaposition between, you know, a system built around freedom and a system built around tyranny. And I think that will then create an atmosphere in which it'll be possible to examine these relationships that have already been built with China and to think about in two ways. Number one is, how do we decouple our economy so we are less dependent on China? And that's a big problem, but I think it's one that has to be addressed and dealt with, including how do we decouple our universities and labs from Chinese research force and workforce. And then number two, how do we bring U.S. economy and U.S. institutions up to the speed that will be necessary in order to continue to compete with China and overtake and surpass China over the next several decades. By 2040, we are told China's economy should surpass the size of the United States, and that may be so. But it's also important to realize that by 2050, Africa will have a population larger than China, and India will have a population at least 1.5 times the size of China as well. Those demographic shifts, those demographic balance will begin to have its effect on world politics and on how we think about these issues going forward as well. And I think that the combination of keeping an idea on the larger global picture at the same time as we think about essential national interests for the United States over this next generation should help to turn some heads. I think they already have. My experience going on Capitol Hill is Democrats and Republicans, this is one bipartisan issue that they can join with. The problem is giving them a program in which to act and in which to move forward here. And that's going to be the new challenge, and that's where I think think tanks can be extremely helpful, including this one, in helping to shape that direction and give people an ideas about, you know what the problem is, these are the principles on which you need to build a response. Now let's figure out what the elements are that go into that response.
Yeah, it's not really my style, but I'm actually going to try to phrase your question a little less confrontationally, which is like one of the interesting things that's happened is that we've had such an erosion of our industrial base that there's actually no longer a really strong lobby to lobby for the things that need to be done. And
that's an important point. That really is.
That is actually the biggest problem. With the Republicans in particular, what's fascinating is that they are out there fighting for people that hate them. Silicon Valley, Wall Street, hedge fund guys, they don't give money to, they give far more money to Democrats and Republicans. But I think and as Arthur said, a lot of it is simply just no longer being able to ignore the issues anymore. And I would say even in the last 3 years, it's changed quite a bit. And the intellectual momentum is definitely on this side, if you will.
I think that's true.
But there isn't a dedicated sector lobby or a dedicated donor base for this. Though I think one will arise in part because, one topic that hasn't been brought up is medicine. Most of our medicines come from China and some from India, but we are totally dependent on foreign suppliers for medicine. That's a pretty shocking situation. And at a certain point, you can't ignore that too much longer.
No, and I think the other issue which arises here that helps that is also served as build a constituency is the issue of IP. And the degree to which IP theft and the loss of IPR to China through various nefarious as well as legal means is one that I think increasingly American companies, even startups, will begin to realize that they've got to deal with the China threat because it absolutely will challenge their bottom line sooner or later because of the way in which what their company and their company is built around is something that will not be theirs if we don't have a way to deal with and confront China's economic and geopolitical aggression in these areas.
No. 1, 2. That's fine. Yes, we can do both. We've got time for both. 2 last questions, please.
Yes, I'm Maya Clark from the Heritage Foundation. I really appreciated your presentation. You discussed the importance of having a focus in industrial policy, and your 2 examples, mobilization of World War II and the space race, there was that focus. I don't know that I see a natural focus in the current situation, except maybe for the 5G race. But would you say that that could act in the same way that, World War II or the space race were kind of this unifying force? Do you think this issue has the unifying power on, kind of an emotional level as well as the logical need level?
I like this question, and I think my initial answer to that is no. 5G could, if everyone really understood how important and how essential 5G is going to become because of its integration with the Internet of Things in terms of our daily lives and who controls it and who manages it and who's able to extract the data that flows from those networks that are all pervasive and ubiquitous everywhere from driverless cars to the thermostat in your home. Maybe then people will begin to realize it really matters who it is who's building those networks and who's maintaining those networks, whether they work for an authoritarian or totalitarian government, or whether they're part of the West and part of a democratic country. But again, I want to come back to this. It's important again to stress with the World War II example that the mobilization begins when the war is not an emotional issue at all. For a lot of people, it was like, why the hell are we doing all this? Why spend this time? Let's stay out of the conflict in Europe. There were those who were sort of Anglophile types who were committed to the idea of, bundles for Britain and all that kind of a thing. But by and large, it was still a very cut and dry, rather sort of abstract issue. The Nazi threat, what does that really mean? For most people, it didn't seem very, very possible. It was incumbent on, and this is where I come back to your question, it was incumbent on those at the top. It was incumbent on those who understood what was at stake, who understood the larger geopolitical value of what and consequences if Britain were to fall, if that British Navy became part of the German Navy, what that world would look like. Those who understood the stakes to begin the process of mobilization, even in ways in the face of public opinion, even sometimes in the face of public opinion, because they knew that they had the means by which to address those problems because it was inevitable that they would be upon them.
One thing to add is also consider how depressing the alternatives are. And not even in the sort of scary authoritarian sense, but simply, do you really, how many people really, they went through all this effort to become successful, and they're going to sit around and sell vaping and food delivery and taxi services as technology? Do you really want to did you really get into finance so that you could do share buybacks and not real investment? All of you people that came here to DC, you got your expensive college educations, you're working in policy. Do you really want to do rent seeking for some boring industry? Or do you want to participate in the high-tech challenge of the future?
So what you're saying is, what does it really say about us if we don't take on the challenge?
Yes, ma'am.
Once again, thanks for a great presentation. My name is Shalise Douglas, and I support the ManTech programs as a communication strategist. So it's been a pleasure to listen and learn a great deal more about this. My main question is, what role do you see the DoD Manufacturing Innovation Institutes playing in industrial policy, but specifically in creating industrial policy leadership and taking a role in that manner?
It's a good question, and I did mention the ManTech and also IBAS as being sort of, they're sort of the tip of the spear over at DoD in addressing these issues, including the supply chain issue that we talked about earlier. It wasn't you, it was the other chap, this chap, who brought that up. I think they can be very important. I think though the effort requires two things. One is it requires, again, more coordination, particularly with industry, to get industry fully on board and understand how important this is, even those perhaps who aren't necessarily defense contractors, but whose own livelihoods will depend upon and could be enhanced by a restored and revivified defense industrial base. But also, at the same time, the resources. I didn't talk a lot about money in this talk. You noticed that, and that was partly deliberate because I wanted you to understand this as both an administrative, a strategic, and a moral effort that underwent. There's no doubt that what incentivized these companies to become involved in the war effort wasn't patriotism, that played its part, obviously. What it was, bottom line, it was getting government contracts, particularly when a peacetime economy opportunities were going to sort of shrink away. So part of what is involved in any kind of industrial policy is directing funding to where it needs to go. And I see offices like ManTech and like IBAS, and also R&E, the people over at R&E and DoD, and the people in logistics and acquisition. I see these as being essential to helping to sort out where that money, where the resources need to go, where personnel has to be brought on board, and where that effort's going to have to go going forward in the future. Very, very, very important here. But the leadership's got to come from up above, in my opinion.
Ladies and gentlemen who are here in the room with us, thank you very much for joining us. Those who are streaming in, thank you so much. Julius Krein, thank you for joining us. And I want to thank Arthur Herman, and to show my great esteem for him, I'm going to give him the last word.
Can I ask the last question? Nobody at all my talks have asked me a key question, and that is, what was, in World War II, the mobilization was about productivity. What was the single most productive company with the single most produced product?
I was going to ask you that.
It's a good thing you brought it up. Well, the answer was Hershey's. Hershey's Candy Company was approached by the Navy to produce what were called D rations. And D rations were what would be, these were survival rations for airmen or seamen who've been lost at sea and who could be, in their lifeboats for days, something just sort of keep the system going.
MREs.
It was the next lower down, even more drastic, D rations. So they went to Hershey's and they said, can you produce a chocolate bar that we can use as D-rations, but it's very important that the chocolate bar not taste good, because we don't want our service people to be tempted to open up their life. This is going to go into every life jacket, tempted to open it up and eat the candy bar. So Hershey's, the CEO of Hershey's, called together all his managers, and they sat up and they said, do you think we could come up with a chocolate that doesn't taste good? And they thought, and they said, I think we could probably do it. And so they did. And they produced over 2 billion of the things. In fact, the last time I checked, you can go on eBay and still buy D-rations produced by Hershey's from World War II. Now, I have not tasted one. 70 years later, I don't know if it tastes any better or any worse. But that was the number one product to come out of world in numbers in World War II. So your curiosity at last has been satisfied.
I was wondering about that. Arthur, thank you very much, and
Thank you, Chris.
congratulations.
Thank you.